The entire ballroom went silent, not because the music stopped, not because the party was over, but because the quiet maid had finally moved. Beverly's hand reached out and grabbed Yuna's arm right before she could hit a small boy. Yuna was the woman everyone feared because she was supposed to marry the Mafia boss, Sung. Because she was going to be the boss's wife, Yuna thought she could hurt anyone she wanted. She was especially mean to Beverly because Beverly was a black woman who was bigger than the other maids. Yuna would point at Beverly and laugh, calling her a slow, fat cow. She even made Beverly eat her lunch in a dark closet because she didn't want to look at her. Beverly stayed quiet for a long time to earn money for her sick sister, but tonight, she had enough. Beverly stood up like a giant mountain in front of the woman who was almost the Mafia queen. She didn't look scared of the guards or the fancy people in the room. She looked Yuna right in the eyes and said, "You have been a bully for too long. Today, it stops." For the first time ever, the queen was the one who looked small. The battle for the Sung Syndicate has just begun. If you're rooting for Beverly, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single twist. We're curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell us your city in the comments. The metal ruler clicked against Beverly's hip, cold and sharp. Yuna did not look at Beverly's face. She only looked at the numbers on the silver stick. To Yuna, the maids were not people. They were just furniture that needed to be in the right spot. Yuna's sharp heel sank into Beverly's stomach, pushing hard enough to leave a bruise. "Too much space," Yuna whispered, her voice like a sliding snake. "You take up too much room in my house, Beverly." Beverly kept her eyes on the floor, her knuckles turning white as she squeezed her cleaning rag. She could feel Yuna's eyes searching for a reason to break her, but the real danger wasn't the ruler. It was the smile Yuna wore when she found a mistake. Yuna turned her back and walked toward an elderly maid holding a silver tray. The pot of tea was steaming, sending white clouds into the cold air of the mansion. Without a word, Yuna tipped the tray with one finger. The boiling water rushed toward the old woman's thin, shaking hands. Beverly moved. Her large frame blurred as she stepped forward, catching the heavy iron pot mid-air. The boiling water splashed across Beverly's own forearm, the skin turning a sudden, angry red. Beverly didn't scream or drop the pot. She simply set it back on the table. "The tea is still hot," Beverly said, her voice steady even as her skin began to blister. Yuna's eyes narrowed, frustrated that she hadn't heard a cry of pain. But as Yuna walked away, she whispered something to a guard that made Beverly's heart skip a beat. Lunch was not served at a table. Beverly sat on a wooden crate inside a broom closet, her knees pressed against her chest. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and dust. Yuna had told the staff that Beverly's size ruined the beauty of the kitchen. Beverly took a bite of cold rice, her mind flashing back to a hospital bed thousands of miles away. She remembered her little sister, Maya, gasping for air in a room that smelled just like this bleach. Every dollar Beverly earned here bought Maya another hour of oxygen. Beverly looked at the small photo in her pocket, the edges frayed from her thumb rubbing it for luck. She had to stay quiet, or the machines keeping Maya alive would stop humming. Suddenly, the closet door swung open, revealing a man who didn't look like he belonged in this house of mirrors. Sung, the head of the syndicate, stood in the hallway. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 years. His suit was expensive, but his shoulders were heavy, sagging under the weight of his own name. He looked at Beverly sitting in the dark, surrounded by mops. For a second, his eyes softened, showing a flicker of a man who hated the cruelty of his own fiancée. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of Yuna's high heels clicking on the marble made him freeze. He pulled his mask of stone back over his face and walked away without a word. Beverly realized then that Sung wasn't the king of this castle, he was just another prisoner. But if the king was trapped, who was really holding the keys? Later that night, Beverly knelt on the floor of Yuna's dressing room, picking up empty designer shoeboxes. Yuna treated her trash like gold, but she was careless. Deep inside a box for red velvet heels, Beverly's fingers found a crumpled slip of paper. It wasn't a receipt for shoes. It was a bank transfer for $5 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Yuna wasn't just a mean bride-to-be. She was a thief. Beverly tucked the paper into her bra, the sharp edge of the slip scratching against her skin. She knew that if Yuna found out, Beverly wouldn't just lose her job, she would lose her life. The bedroom door creaked open, and Yuna stood there, her eyes landing directly on the empty shoe box in Beverly's hand. "Are you stealing my memories, you fat waste of space?" Yuna's voice cracked like a whip across the room. She walked closer, her perfume smelling like rotting flowers. Beverly stood up, towering over the smaller woman, but she kept her head bowed in the maid's pose. Una reached out and slapped Beverly, the sound echoing off the gold-leafed walls. Beverly's cheek stung, the taste of copper filling her mouth as her tooth cut her lip. Yes, Beverly replied, her voice a low rumble. I am just clearing the path for your greatness. As she spoke, Beverly's eyes stayed fixed on the digital keypad of Una's private safe, her mind recording every button Una's fingers had touched earlier. Una laughed, thinking she had one, but Beverly was already building a cage for the viper. The moonlight hit the photo of Maya again as Beverly lay in her tiny cot that night. Her arm burned from the tea, and her face throbbed from the slap. Every injury was a payment for Maya's life. She thought about the $5 million and the tired look in Sung's eyes. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a witness to a crime that could burn the entire syndicate down. If she spoke, Maya might die. If she stayed silent, Una would destroy everyone in the house. A soft knock came at her door, but it wasn't a maid or a friend. It was the sound of a heavy boot, and the light under her door was blocked by a shadow holding a gun. The shadow under the door didn't move, and neither did Beverly. She gripped the iron fire poker beneath her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The door creaked open, but it wasn't a bullet that entered. It was Una, holding a crumpled piece of paper like a trophy. It was the letter from Maya, the one Beverly had hidden under her mattress, filled with shaky handwriting and spelling errors. Una smoothed the paper against the wall, a cruel light dancing in her eyes. Your sister writes like a dying animal, Beverly, Una laughed, her voice cutting through the silence of the servants' quarters. Beverly's knuckles turned a ghostly white as she stepped out of the shadows, the smell of Una's expensive perfume choking the small room. Una didn't stop at the doorway. She walked into the hall where the other maids were waking up, shaking the letter in the air. Listen to this poverty-stricken poetry, Una mocked, reading Maya's private prayers for Beverly's safety out loud. The staff watched in horror, their heads bowed, but Beverly stood tall, her massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed Una whole. Every word out of Una's mouth was a hot iron pressed against Beverly's soul, reminding her of the day the debt collectors took their mother's wedding ring. Beverly didn't beg for the letter back. She simply watched the way Una's thumb shook against the paper. The Queen was putting on a show, but her shaking hand revealed a secret fear she couldn't hide. Since you all have time to listen to stories, you clearly have too much energy, Una snapped, crumpling the letter into a ball and dropping it into a puddle. She announced a fasting day for the entire staff, claiming a silver spoon had vanished from the morning set. Beverly knew the spoon wasn't lost. She had seen Una slide it into her own silk handbag 10 minutes earlier. The younger maids began to tremble, their stomachs already empty from a week of thin soup and hard bread. Una smiled, enjoying the sight of their shrinking spirits, and turned to Beverly. Maybe a day without food will help you fit into the furniture, Mountain, Una hissed, but as she turned to leave, she tripped over a loose floorboard Beverly had intentionally left unnailed. By midnight, the mansion was a tomb of hungry whispers. Beverly moved through the darkened pantry, her footsteps heavy and rhythmic, a sound that usually made people look away. She used the noise of her own weight to mask the clicking of the bread bin and the rustle of cheesecloth. She wasn't just stealing food, she was distributing survival. Beverly handed a thick slice of rye to a girl whose ribs were starting to show through her uniform, the girl's hands shaking as she took the bread. Beverly's own stomach groaned, a hollow ache that felt exactly like the winters in Detroit when the heat was turned off. She was about to hand out the last roll when a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, pinning her against the shelves. The guard was half Beverly's size, but the black pistol on his hip made him feel like a giant. He stepped into the pantry, his lip curling in a sneer as he looked at the bread in Beverly's hand. Una said no one eats, or everyone bleeds, he whispered, his finger hovering near the holster. Beverly didn't drop the bread. She stepped closer until her chest was inches from his face, forcing him to look up at a steep angle. The air between them grew hot, the smell of his sweat sharp and sour. The girl is hungry, Beverly said, her voice a low, vibrating bass that made the jars on the shelves rattle. The guard's hand shook, his confidence evaporating as he realized that his gun was small compared to the wall of muscle standing over him. He lowered the light, but as he backed away, he muttered a name into his radio that Beverly didn't recognize. The next morning, the youngest maid, Kim, collapsed in the laundry room, her spirit finally snapping under the weight of Una's threats. Kim sobbed that she wanted to quit, but Una appeared in the doorway like a ghost, holding a folder with Kim's family address on the cover. "If you walk out that gate, your parents won't make it to dinner," Una whispered, her voice a cold promise of death. The girl shivered, her eyes glazing over with the look of a person who had already given up on living. Beverly stepped in front of the girl, blocking Yuna's view, and leaned down to whisper in Kim's ear. "Don't let the viper see you bleed," Beverly murmured, her voice like grinding stone. "Hold on, because the wind is changing, and it's bringing a storm she won't survive." Sleep was impossible, so Beverly retreated to the moonlit garden at 3 a.m. to tend to her burned arm. She sat on a stone bench, the smell of jasmine thick in the air, when a shadow detached itself from the oak tree. It was Sung. He didn't have his guards, and his expensive tie was loosened, hanging like a noose around his neck. He watched her for a long time, noticing that unlike every other person in his life, she didn't jump or tremble in his presence. "Why aren't you afraid of me, Beverly Cooper?" he asked, his voice sounding more like a tired child than a mafia king. Beverly looked him in the eye, her gaze steady and unforgiving. "I've seen real monsters, sir, and they don't wear suits," she replied. Sung stepped closer, the moonlight revealing a bruise on his own jaw that matched the one Yuna had given Beverly. The morning of the gala arrived not with sunlight, but with the sound of a shattering porcelain vase. Yuna marched through the grand hall, her silk robe snapping like a whip against her legs as she struck a young footman across the ear for the crime of breathing too loudly. The estate was a hive of terrified bees, but Yuna was the smoke, choking the life out of every room she entered. She stopped in front of Beverly, her eyes scanning the mountain with a predatory hunger for humiliation. "A special night requires a special look for our most prominent piece of furniture," Yuna whispered, tossing a bundle of scratchy, blue polyester at Beverly's feet. The fabric was stiff and cheap, and even a blind man could see the seams were stitched to fit a woman half Beverly's size. Beverly pulled the uniform on in the shadows of the laundry room, the sound of threads popping echoing like tiny gunshots. The sleeves bit into her biceps, turning her skin a mottled purple, and the collar choked her throat so tightly she could barely swallow. She looked in the cracked mirror, seeing not a maid, but a woman being bound like a Christmas ham for the amusement of the elite guests. Her mind flashed back to the playground 30 years ago, the sound of children laughing as they tore her favorite dress, the feeling of being too big for a world that wanted her small. She forced her breath out in a slow, jagged hiss, reminding herself that the tightness in her chest wasn't shame, it was the coiled spring of a trap about to be sprung. But as she reached for her apron, her hand brushed a velvet curtain, revealing a folder Yuna had hidden behind the cleaning supplies. Beverly flipped the pages, her eyes widening as she saw blueprints of the ballroom with red X marks over Sung's private balcony and the security hub. This wasn't a wedding plan. It was a roadmap for a massacre. Yuna wasn't just stealing money. She was selling the syndicate's soul to the ghost gang, and the transaction was scheduled for the stroke of midnight. Beverly stuffed the map into the waist of her tight skirt, the sharp paper digging into her hip, a constant reminder that she was the only shield standing between Sung and a bullet. She stepped into the glittering ballroom, her too small uniform drawing sneers from the arriving billionaires, but her eyes were fixed on the shadows. She caught Sung's gaze across the room, but before she could signal him, a high-pitched crash sent a shockwave through the crowd. Leo, a 10-year-old orphan who spent his days polishing silver, stood frozen over a sea of shattered glass and deep red Cabernet. The wine had splashed upward, blooming like a bloodstain across the hem of Yuna's $50,000 white silk gown. The ballroom went so silent the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Yuna didn't scream. She moved with a slow, terrifying grace, her face twisting into a mask of pure, jagged hate. She snatched a heavy, brass-handled cane from an elderly guest, the metal gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "I told you that mistakes are paid for in blood," Yuna hissed, the cane whistling through the air as she aimed it directly at the boy's temple. Beverly didn't think. She became the earthquake. The tight seams of her uniform exploded, buttons flying like shrapnel as she lunged across the marble floor. Her massive hand shot out, the brass handle of the cane stopping inches from Leo's skull with a bone-jarring thud. The vibration of the impact traveled up Beverly's arm, but she didn't flinch, her feet planted like ancient oaks in the center of the room. Yuna pulled at the cane, her face turning a blotchy red as she realized she couldn't move the woman holding it. The guests gasped, some dropping their champagne flutes, as the quiet mountain finally showed its fire. Yuna's voice came out as a ragged snarl, her eyes darting to the guards who were already drawing their weapons. "Release that, you fat cow, or I will have you slaughtered where you stand," she spat, her spit landing on Beverly's cheek. Beverly didn't wipe it away. She simply tightened her grip on the brass, the metal groaning under her strength. She looked at the guards, then at the terrified boy behind her, and finally back at the woman who had spent months trying to break her. The trauma of the past, the hunger of the present, and the threat of the future all melted into a single, cold point of resolve. "Move," Una screamed, her hand rising to slap Beverly's face. Beverly didn't move an inch. She leaned down until her face was level with Una's, her voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the entire empire. "Make me." The blue polyester scratched Beverly's skin like 1,000 tiny needles, the fabric groaning with every breath she took. Una had chosen this uniform to turn Beverly's body into a joke, a tight cage meant to split open and expose her to the laughter of the rich. Sweat pooled in the small of Beverly's back, unable to escape the cheap plastic fibers, yet she stood like a statue. As she moved through the golden light of the ballroom with a tray of caviar, Una's voice sliced through the music. "Look at the size of the livestock I had to import from America." Una laughed to a group of jewelry-clad wives, her finger pointing at Beverly's straining seams. The mockery felt like a familiar ghost, the same cold laughter Beverly heard when she was a child in a crowded shelter, but she didn't flinch. She was a mountain, and mountains do not move for the wind, yet the wind was about to become a hurricane. Beverly moved toward the shadows near Sung, but her blood turned to ice when she heard Una's whisper. "The moment we say I do, the trash goes out," Una told Sung, her eyes fixed on the maids. "I'm firing them all, no pay, no references. They can starve in the streets for all I care." 50 families would lose their homes by sunrise, including the mother of the girl Beverly had fed in secret. Beverly's knuckles turned white against the silver tray, her mind screaming to strike, but she had to wait. She stepped into the dim coatroom to regroup, only to see Una pressing a silver flash drive into the palm of a man with a ghost gang tattoo on his neck. The queen wasn't just a bully. She was a traitor selling the keys to the kingdom to the highest bidder. Beverly ducked behind a mink coat, but the sound of a heavy boot behind her meant she wasn't the only one watching. She escaped the coatroom just as the center of the ballroom became a stage for a tragedy. Leo, the 10-year-old with the hollow eyes of a child who had forgotten how to play, carried the vintage 1945 wine toward the head table. His small hands shook so violently the glass rattled against the silver bucket, his face pale with exhaustion. Beverly saw Una's diamond-encrusted heel slide out across the marble like a trap. The crash was deafening, the dark red wine blooming across Una's white silk gown like a fresh gunshot wound. The music died instantly, leaving a silence so heavy it hurt the ears. Una didn't scream. She slowly reached for a heavy silver platter, her eyes locked on the trembling boy, her smile jagged and wrong. "You spilled blood on my dress, little rat," Una whispered, the silver platter gleaming like a blade in her hand. "So I think I'll take yours to match the color." She raised the heavy metal high, her arm tense to crush the boy's skull in front of 500 witnesses. Beverly let her tray fall, the clang of silver on marble echoing like a war drum. She didn't run. She marched, her heavy footsteps vibrating through the floor, a rhythmic thud that demanded the room's attention. She stepped over the shattered glass and stood over Leo, her massive frame eclipsing the boy entirely. She looked at Sung, whose face was a mask of shock, and then she turned her gaze toward Una, staring directly into the rot of the woman's soul. "Get back to the kitchen, you obese waste." Una screamed, her face twisting until she looked like a gargoyle. "You are a servant. You are nothing but a shadow in my house." The guests leaned in, some filming on their phones, waiting for the maid to break and crawl away. Beverly's voice didn't shake. It came from deep in her chest, a low rumble that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. "I might be a shadow," Beverly said, her eyes burning with the fire of every person Una had ever stepped on. "But even shadows have a limit to how much filth they'll cover up." Una's face went purple with rage, and she lunged forward, not with the platter, but with a hidden knife she pulled from her bodice. Una's face twisted into a jagged snarl, the composure of a queen dissolving into the madness of a cornered predator. She swung the heavy silver platter with a desperate, whistling speed aimed directly at Beverly's temple. Beverly did not blink. She stepped into the strike, her massive hand shooting out to meet the metal mid-air. The sound of palm hitting silver echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, the platter denting inward around Beverly's iron grip. A collective gasp rippled through the 500 elites as they watched the slow maid stop a lethal blow with the casual strength of a titan. But as Beverly held the metal steady, she saw the guards in the balconies shifting their rifles toward her head. Beverly leaned into Una's space, her voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried to the very front row. "Your jewelry is stolen, your heart is empty, and your time is up," she whispered, her words cutting deeper than any blade. Una's eyes went wide, her fingers curling into claws as she lunged forward to scratch at Beverly's eyes. Instinct took over, fueled by years of protecting the weak in the streets of Detroit and the hospital rooms of her past. Beverly's right hand pulled back and launched a heavyweight crosshook that connected squarely with Yuna's jaw. The impact was a sickening crunch of bone and ego, a sound that felt like the final brick falling in a collapsing house. Yuna's head snapped back with a violent jerk, and her string of pearls exploded, the white beads bouncing across the marble floor like hail in a storm. The Mafia queen fell in slow motion, her body crashing backward into a 3-tier birthday cake. The white frosting and red jam splattered across her face, mixing with the real blood leaking from her split lip. She lay there, a ruined doll in a silver gown, gasping for air that tasted of sugar and copper. The 500 most dangerous men in the world stood frozen, their champagne forgotten, as they stared at the maid who had just dismantled an empire's future with one hand. Beverly stood over her, chest heaving against the ripped seams of her blue uniform, her knuckles throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat. Then, the heavy thud of leather boots on the dais drew every eye to the center of the room. Sung descended the stairs with a face of frozen granite, his eyes never leaving Beverly. As he reached the floor, 10 red laser dots appeared on Beverly's chest, the sniper's fingers tightening on their triggers. Beverly didn't lower her head. She stared directly into the eyes of the man who held her life in his hands. She was going to kill that boy, Beverly said, her voice cracking but holding its ground. She's been killing the soul of this house for months, and tonight, she was going to finish the job. Sung stopped inches from her, his shadow swallowing her, yet he made no move to strike. Beverly reached into the pocket of her torn apron and pulled out the silver flash drive, holding it out between them. She's not just a bully, Sung. She's a traitor selling your security codes to the ghost gang, she said, the metal cool against her sweating palm. Sung took the drive, his thumb brushing against Beverly's bruised knuckles, a flicker of something human crossing his stone-cold expression. From the wreckage of the cake, Yuna pushed herself up, spitting a tooth onto the floor as she shrieked at the guards. Execute her. Execute the fat maid and the boy. Yuna's voice was a ragged howl, her face a mask of gore and frosting. The guards looked at Yuna, then at the flash drive in Sung's hand, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like it would snap. Sung looked at the blooded woman he was supposed to marry, then back at the dignified, bruised woman in the torn blue dress. He raised a single hand, and the red laser dots vanished from Beverly's chest. Take the queen to the holding cells, Sung commanded, his voice a low bell that signaled the end of an era. The guards moved with chilling efficiency, dragging a screaming Yuna away from the light and into the dark. Sung turned back to Beverly, gesturing toward the velvet chair at the head table that had been reserved for royalty. Give the maid a chair, Sung said, his eyes finally showing the respect he had hidden for so long. She has earned the right to sit in my presence, and I have a great many questions about who has been running my house. The ballroom was a graveyard of broken crystal and cake, but the army of mops did not move. In the kitchen, the cooks stood with crossed arms and the laundry girls sat on the floor, their faces set like flint. No one scrubbed the wine from the marble. No one gathered the scattered pearls. The mountain stands, so we stand, the head chef muttered, staring down a guard whose hand hovered nervously over his holster. This was the first time in the history of the Sung Syndicate that the machinery of service had ground to a halt. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed dishes and rebellion, a silence that screamed louder than any siren. But the silence was broken by the heavy thud of the study door closing upstairs, where Beverly sat in the lion's den. The private study smelled of old leather and expensive tobacco. Sung sat behind a desk of dark oak, his eyes scanning the woman who had shattered his wedding plans with a single hook. He noticed the blood dripping from Beverly's knuckles, staining the velvet of the chair he had ordered her to sit in. Without a word, he pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and slid it across the wood. Beverly didn't take it. She kept her hands folded, the skin split and angry. You bleed for a boy you barely know, Sung said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Beverly looked at the handkerchief, then back at him, her eyes as hard as the stones in the garden. In my world, you don't need a reason to stop a child from being murdered, she replied. Sung's hand paused in midair, a flicker of something like shame crossing his face before the door opened and the real trial began. Beverly didn't use flowery words. She used facts like bullets. She spoke of the withheld pay that left families hungry and the passports locked in Yuna's safe like trophies of war. She detailed the physical hits, the burning tea, and the psychological games that had turned the estate into a cage. The gardener's daughter is coughing blood because she can't afford the medicine you promised in the contract, Beverly said, her voice cracking for the first time. Sung looked down at his own hands, realizing the blood on his empire wasn't just from his enemies. He thought of his own mother, who had died waiting for a doctor while he was building his throne, and the muscle in his jaw jumped. He reached for his phone to call his personal physician, but the sound of heavy chains rattling in the hall stopped him cold. Yuna was dragged into the room, her silver gown torn and her perfect face a mess of bruises and drying frosting. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting to Sung with a desperate, manipulative light. "She's a liar. Sung. She's brainwashed them all to steal from us." Yuna shrieked, her voice a jagged glass shard. She tried to lean into his space, using the beauty she had always used as a shield, but Sung didn't move. Beverly didn't argue. She simply pulled a ledger from her apron. The double-entry books Yuna thought were hidden forever. $12 million, Beverly stated, her voice flat. "Stolen from the pension funds of the men who protect your life." Yuna's face went pale, the lie dying in her throat as the office door opened once more. One by one, the invisible people walked into the light. The cook with the burned hand, the gardener with the hollow eyes, and the laundry girl who had been threatened with exile. They stood in a line, emboldened by the image of Beverly's fist connecting with Yuna's jaw. "She took my wedding ring to pay for a service fee," the cook whispered. "She hit me because I didn't bow low enough," the laundry girl added. Yuna watched her power evaporate, her breathing becoming shallow and fast. She looked at the circle of servants, then at the black woman who had led them to her door. The breaking point didn't come with a blow, but with a word. Yuna lunged toward Beverly, the chains clashing, and hurled a racial slur so vile the room seemed to go sub-zero. The Mafia guards, men who had killed for sport, looked away in disgust, their respect for Yuna vanishing in an instant. Sung stood up, his chair hitting the wall with a crash that sounded like a gavel. "You are not a queen," he said, his voice a cold, final judgment. "You are a parasite that has been eating my house from the inside out." He turned to his head of security and ordered his best doctors to the servants' quarters immediately, his eyes never leaving the woman in the blue uniform. Sung walked around the desk and stood before Beverly, his shadow long and dark. "You are no longer a maid in this house, Beverly Cooper," he said, the laser dots of the guard's sights finally turning away from her. He looked at her tattered clothes and her bruised face, seeing a strength he hadn't found in 1,000 soldiers. "A woman who can punch a queen and speak truth to a king. What do you want?" Beverly didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for the millions in the ledger or a ticket to a luxury island. She looked at the line of workers behind her. "Give them their passports," she said. "Clear their debts, and let them be free." Sung nodded once, a silent vow, but as the staff began to cheer, the lights in the mansion flickered and died. A high-pitched, electronic whine filled the room, and the red emergency lights began to pulse. The silent alarm on Sung's desk glowed a violent, steady crimson. Yuna's rival business partners, the men she had promised the security codes to, had arrived to collect the prize they had already paid for. The heavy iron shutters of the study slammed shut, locking them all in the dark. The heavy iron shutters of the study vibrated with the force of a distant explosion, but inside, a new kind of silence had taken root. With Yuna locked in the basement, the frantic, terrified energy of the estate had evaporated, leaving behind a cautious, shared breath. Maids who once looked at the floor now looked at each other, their movements slow and deliberate rather than panicked. In Sung's hand, a burner phone recovered from Yuna's vanity buzzed with mechanical persistence, the screen flashing an unsaved number from the Ghost Syndicate. "The rats are scratching at the door, Sung," Beverly said, her voice steady even as a fresh drop of sweat traced the line of her jaw. Sung stared at the vibrating phone, realizing the woman he almost married had left the back door wide open for his executioners. Beverly retreated to the kitchen, where the younger maids huddled like frightened birds near the industrial stoves. She didn't offer empty words. She took a basin of warm water and began washing the grime and dried tears from Kim's small, shaking hands. The sight of the purple bruises on the girl's wrists made Beverly's chest tighten, a phantom pain blooming where her own scars lay hidden. She remembered her own mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from 3 jobs, always working to keep the lights on until they finally flickered out. Beverly realized she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the mother mountain these girls used to hide from the wind. But the moment of peace shattered when a syndicate guard entered, not with a weapon, but with a tray of hot tea and a stack of clean pillows for Beverly. The guard avoided her eyes, his ears turning red as he set the tray down. "My mother has hands like yours," he muttered, a silent admission of a brotherhood built on respect rather than fear. Beverly nodded, the steam from the tea hitting her face, a small victory in a house built on blood. She turned her attention to the financial ledgers spread across the flour-dusted table, pointing out the jagged lines of a shell company scheme that was bleeding Sung dry. "Yuna didn't just steal your money, Sung," She turned your accounts into a sieve, Beverly explained, her American education cutting through the complex fraud like a scalpel. Sung watched her, the realization sinking in that he had been robbed by the person in his bed while being protected by the woman he had treated like furniture. He reached for a piece of bread, but the sound of Yuna's screaming voice echoed through the vents from the holding cells below. In the dark of the basement, Yuna pressed her face against the cold bars, her voice a ragged, desperate silk. $1 million, Sergeant, she whispered to the guard on duty, her eyes wide and manic. Kill the American Mountain and open this door, and you will never have to work a day in your life. She tried to smile, the frosting still matted in her hair, a grotesque parody of the beauty she once used as a weapon. The guard didn't even look at her. He simply spat on the floor and turned his back, moved by the quiet dignity he had seen in Beverly's eyes. Yuna's scream of rejection was cut short by the chirp of Beverly's personal cell phone, a call from a hospital 10,000 miles away. Beverly's hands trembled as she answered, the voice of her sister, Maya, coming through the static. The bill is gone, Bev, Maya sobbed, her voice stronger than it had been in months. An anonymous donor from Seoul paid for everything, including the surgery. Beverly's eyes blurred, the weight of the world finally lifting from her shoulders as she realized Maya was safe. She looked at Sung, who stood by the window with his back to her, his silence his only confession. He had settled the debt of her heart, but the sound of a perimeter alarm triggered a new, more lethal debt. I thought cruelty was the only way to hold a crown, Sung admitted, his voice barely a whisper against the glass. I watched her break you because I thought a broken staff was a loyal one, but your fist taught me more than my father ever did. He turned to her, the stone mask finally gone, replaced by the face of a man who wanted to be better. Integrity is a foundation, he said, and mine is currently made of sand. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but the glass in the window behind him suddenly disintegrated into 1,000 diamonds. The siege didn't start with a knock, it started with a breach. The estate's perimeter lights died, replaced by the red glare of flares as the Ghost Syndicate arrived to collect on Yuna's failed promises. Shadows moved through the gardens with military precision, the sound of suppressed gunfire thwipping through the air. Instead of running for the armored cars, Beverly grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, its weight a familiar comfort in her large hand. She didn't hide. She herded the terrified staff into the kitchen's walk-in safe room, her body becoming the door. Get inside. Don't look back. Beverly commanded, her voice a thunderclap that cut through the screams of the maids. She stood at the entrance, the iron poker raised, her shadow stretching across the floor like a giant's. She saw the first of the masked invaders round the corner, their rifles leveled at her chest. She wasn't a maid, and she wasn't a shadow. She was the shield, and the only way to the innocent was through her. The study door didn't open. It exploded off its hinges. Through the haze of splintered oak and acrid gunpowder, a man stepped into the light, his face a roadmap of scars and ancient grudges. This was the rival, the ghost who had haunted the Syndicate's borders for years, but he didn't raise his weapon at Sung. I didn't come for your life, Sung, the rival rasped, the smell of expensive cigars clinging to his heavy coat. I came for the $10 million your queen swore I stole from your father's vault. Sung stood his ground, his hand hovering over a hidden drawer, while Beverly stepped forward, her iron poker casting a long, jagged shadow across the room. The rival turned his cold gaze toward her, his finger twitching on the trigger as he realized a maid was the only thing standing between him and his vengeance. The air in the room grew thick and suffocating as the guards dragged Yuna in, her chains clinking like a funeral bell. She looked at the rival and let out a sharp, jagged laugh, her eyes bright with a dying light. You're both fools, she spat, her voice a poisonous silk. You'll kill each other over a ghost story while I walk out of here a billionaire. Beverly didn't speak. She reached into the hem of her own uniform and pulled out a micro-SD card she had ripped from the lining of Yuna's backup gala gown. The ghost has a face, and it looks just like yours, Yuna, Beverly said, her voice a low, steady drumbeat. She slid the card across the desk, the plastic clicking against the wood like a falling tooth. As the video began to play on the wall monitor, showing Yuna's own hands emptying the vault 5 years ago, the rival's face went from pale to a deep, bruising purple. Yuna watched her own betrayal play out in high definition, and the mask finally shattered. She didn't beg, she began to laugh hysterically, the sound echoing off the cold marble walls like breaking glass. I hated every second in this pigsty, she shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rot. I hated the smells, the servants, and the boring weight of your honor, Sung. She turned her venom on Beverly, Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure hate. "And you? You think you're a hero?" Yuna screamed, her voice cracking with a high-pitched rage. "You're just a fat maid who will be forgotten by morning, a mountain of flesh that nobody will ever love." Beverly's mind flashed to the hospital bills, the long nights of hunger, and the way the world had always tried to make her feel invisible. Beverly stepped closer to the chained woman, her presence so massive it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "A maid cleans up trash, Yuna," Beverly said, her voice calm and heavy with a dignity that couldn't be bought. "And today, I'm finally finished with my shift." She looked at Sung and nodded toward the rival, who was watching the screen with tears of rage in his eyes. Sung didn't hesitate. He reached into the wall safe and pulled out a heavy briefcase, sliding it across the desk toward the man he had called an enemy for a decade. The $10 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the war that had just been averted by a woman in a torn apron. The rival took the case, his eyes lingering on Beverly with a sudden, sharp respect before he signaled his men to vanish into the night. Sung turned to Yuna, his eyes colder than the winter moon. "I didn't marry a queen," he said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "I almost married a parasite." Yuna reached out a shaking hand, trying one last time to use her beauty, her fingers clawing at his silk lapel. "Sung, please, think of our life together," she whimpered, the taste of copper and defeat filling her mouth. Sung didn't strike her. He simply stepped back, letting her hand fall into the empty air. He looked at his guards and gave a command that was worse than a death sentence for a woman who lived for the spotlight. "Strip her," Sung commanded, his voice a flat line of ice. "Take the name, take the jewels, and take every stitch of silk she owns." The guards moved in, ignoring Yuna's screams as they tore the diamond necklace from her throat and the silver gown from her back. They left her in a cheap, grey tracksuit, the kind the lowest prisoners wore, and dragged her toward a waiting unmarked car. She wasn't being taken to a grave. She was being taken to the airport with a one-way ticket to a life where no one knew her name and no one cared about her face. As the car sped away, Beverly felt the heavy weight in her chest finally dissolve, but a new shadow appeared at the edge of the estate. The sun rose over the Sung estate, but the light hit a different world. The iron bolts on the servants' entrance didn't just slide, they were welded shut, a permanent scar on the side of the mansion. Now, the cooks and gardeners walked through the front mahogany doors, their boots clicking on the same marble where Yuna's pearls had once scattered like teeth. Beverly stood in the center of the ballroom, her blue uniform replaced by a sharp, tailored suit that didn't pinch or tear. Sung stood on the dais, but he wasn't looking at the elite, he was holding a stack of leather-bound folders. He handed the first one to the head chef, not with a command, but with a steady, lingering eye contact that signaled the return of a stolen life. Each folder contained a passport and a house deed, a total restoration of the dignity Yuna had tried to bury under her heels. Yet, as the last folder was handed out, Sung turned to Beverly with a look that suggested the debt wasn't fully paid. "A house needs a heart, but an empire needs a conscience," Sung said, his voice echoing in the rafters. He stepped down to Beverly's level, offering her a silver key that opened every door in his syndicate. "I want you as my chief of operations, Beverly. No one else has the strength to tell me when my hands are getting dirty." The room went silent, the guards and the staff waiting for the mountain to claim her throne. Beverly looked at the key, then at her own hands, where the scars from the boiling tea had finally faded into silver lines. She remembered the day she left Detroit, promising Maya she would only stay until the air was clear. "My sister graduates in 3 days, Sung," Beverly replied, her voice a low, immovable vibration. "She needs to see that her sister didn't just survive this place, she finished it." Sung's face flickered with a brief, sharp disappointment, but he closed his hand over the key and pulled a different document from his coat. The private jet sat on the tarmac, its engines a low hum that vibrated through Beverly's heels. Sung stood at the bottom of the stairs, a lifetime pension contract tucked into his pocket, but his eyes were fixed on the small boy clinging to Beverly's legs. Leo's face was wet, his small fingers gripping the fabric of Beverly's slacks as if he were trying to hold onto the only wall that had ever shielded him from the wind. "I'll be waiting for your application to Harvard, Leo," Beverly whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed a small, brass-handled card into his hand. "When the time comes, I'll be the one waiting at the gate." She stood up, her frame casting a long, protective shadow over the boy one last time. She turned to board the plane, but a sudden shift in the air made her stop. Sung, the man who had ordered executions with a whisper, took a long step back. He didn't offer a handshake or a cold nod. He bent his body into a deep, 90-degree bow, a sign of ultimate respect usually reserved for gods or kings. The guards behind him followed suit, a wave of black suits dipping in unison before the woman in the doorway. Beverly felt the sting of salt in her eyes, the taste of copper in her mouth replaced by the clean air of the morning. She climbed the stairs and took her seat in the velvet cabin, the plane lifting her away from the blood and the silk. She looked at her knuckles, healed and smooth, and realized she wasn't bringing home just money. She was bringing home the end of a war. The hospital doors in Detroit swung open, and the smell of bleach no longer felt like a cage. Beverly walked down the hall, her footsteps heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a woman who knew exactly who she was. Maya was standing by the window, her breath deep and clear, the machines that once hummed for her life now silent and dark. When Maya saw her, she didn't see a maid or a servant. She saw the savior of the family who had walked through fire to bring back the dawn. They collided in a hug that felt like a bridge finally being finished, the weight of the past dropping away like a discarded rag. Everyone feared the Korean Mafia boss's fiancée, but they should have been watching the woman who was cleaning up the mess.